So I will not deal with, unfortunately today, not with Hannah Arendt and Jacques Rancière together, but I will draw on possibilities of applying Rancière's views to the poetics and politics of Ljubljana, that is, to the interwar period in which Social Democratic Workers' Party of Austria, SDAP, developed cultural and educational policies or supported politics of aesthetics that are, to my opinion, structurally related to Rancière's own conceptions of art and aesthetic revolution. The aim of the paper is to discuss possible junctions between Rancière's understanding of aesthetic revolution and the historical achievements and impasses of the Viennese social democratic politics. I will first deal with the provenience of Rancière's views on aesthetics, and this is also something which has already been discussed in the last paper. And then I will depart from his distinction or conjoining of romantic art and the art of the avant-garde. Disappointed in the violent outcomes of the French Revolution, Friedrich Schiller proposed in his letters upon the aesthetic education of man a reconciliation of the private man and the public individual. It was the mission and duty of aesthetic education to make this reconciliation possible. Schiller conjoined art and politics in the building of the aesthetic state. He rejected the idea of any general constraint imposed from without, be it a Rousseauian obedience to the general will, be it a Kantian obedience to the moral law and the practical interest resulting from it. It was not laws, but only aesthetic ideals that could mediate between the diverging poles of private and public. With these theoretical constellations, Schiller has employed a sort of, let's say, all-inclusive cultural and political policy, warranting to citizens both their natural freedom and simultaneously the right and obligation to public involvement in the communal life. Nevertheless, Schiller's aesthetic state was haunted by the spectre of universality that was accessible only to the chosen few privileged enough to receive it. Joseph Hitry, who authored a study on the aesthetic state in modern German thought, remarks that the letters upon the aesthetic education of man ends by restricting Schiller's living political state to a few sensitive souls and small circles of the chosen, and in fact Schiller admits it himself. The totality of Rousseau's ideal of the people turns into an elitism of those who are able to herald and instantiate this ideal. It goes without saying that the elitist detachment of the sensitive forerunners was, of course, not only Schiller's problem. It befalls almost every artistic and political avant-garde, perpetuating itself along the lines of many later political and aesthetic projects. Sharing the starting point with Schiller, Rancière seeks for practices, art practices, that remain indifferent to authority, hierarchy, and hegemony. Following Rancière, one could and should stress the importance of those revolutionary changes that didn't culminate in violent turmoils and conflicts. Here, one may consider the Paris Commune and May '68 as more important and more democratic than the revolutions of 1789 and 1848, because they, the former, I think, represented a break with economism in the name of the cultural and political. Following the aforementioned all-inclusive cultural and political policy, Rancière develops a twofold conception of the so-called aesthetic regime. He draws a distinction between the romantic art and the avant-garde, whereby one should not identify these two types with successive periods at the art history timeline. In what follows, I will not delve into Rancière's aesthetic regime and Austromarxist cultural politics separately, but I will combine these two possibly parallel theoretical and political positions in order to ask whether Austromarxism could be taken as a historical example of Rancière's ideal of the aesthetic regime. And here I also refer to similar project or similar books written by Christine Ross on the Paris Commune on May '68, or also Davide Panagia's book on the aesthetics of yes, thank you, in Italian piazzas, for example. And now I come to the romantic art. The political impulse of Romantic aesthetics consists in hybridizing the previously separated spheres and members of political community and in bringing about new distributions of the sensible, new proclamations of equality. Hybridity, Kant's and Schiller's gesture of putting two worlds into one, is pivotal in Rancière's endorsement of aesthetic abolishment of social stratification. Since early writings up to aesthesis, his last major study on aesthetic disruptions, Rancière calls for amalgamation and hybridization of public and private, head and hand, which includes the abolishment of the distinction between privileged and deprived members of political community, between those who enjoy enough muse in order to participate in political and artistic life and those to whom the insipid and idle everyday is withheld. It is precisely in the theoretical, cultural and literary production of the so-called Red Vienna that diverse political and social subjects seem to accomplish the ideal of amalgamation and hybridization of head and hand. The interwar period in Vienna is remembered as an intriguing and much disputed attempt to maneuver between the poles of liberalism and futile reformism on the one side and revolutionary Marxism or Bolshevism on the other. When speaking of the Austromarxist aesthetic regime, historians often refer to the synthetic character of as a special feature of Viennese social poetics. In fact, it was already Otto Bauer who deployed the term integral socialism and classified Austromarxism as he says, synthesis of sober realism and revolutionary optimism, which is also the question of hope we had recently. As well as Alfred Foser, literary sociologist and author of the pertinent volume Literature and Austromarxism, who speaks of a synthesis of realistic and humanistic ideals. So we may say that Austromarxism implemented this synthesis or hybridization on many levels. It merged political emancipation with cultural emancipation, including also women's emancipation, political work of the party with the educational work, theory with praxis, and bourgeois, which is also very interesting, bourgeois traditions, and Kant and Schiller were considered to be bourgeois. So bourgeois traditions of high culture with the proletarian way of life. Most scholars that have been committed to these studies have tried to position Austromarxism somewhere in the span between two final positions of reformism and Bolshevism, but not many of them have focused on Austromarxist hybridity as a revolutionary gesture as such. In fact, Austromarxist hybridity was not meant to be revolutionary in the proper sense of the word. These theoreticians explicitly classify their aesthetics and politics as an evolutionary, and I think this is also a case in point in Rancière's theory of evolution, which is somewhere between, revolution, which is somewhere between evolutionary development and revolutionary disruptions or events. Now, my special attention goes to the literary articulations of political subjectivities that emerge in literary works authored by some authors who were considered to be Austromarxist or partly Austromarxist. There are some of them. I will discuss now only Herminia Zurmühlen. She is not a famous author at all. Another more famous would be Hugo Bettauer, after his novel The City Without Jews was screened a movie in 1924. It is also a great example of hybridity of the Viennese, like Austrians and Jews. Herminia Zurmühlen's work is exemplary both for Rancière's ideal of social mixing as for his instruction, so to say, that aesthetic revolution may only come along if art ceases to be art and becomes life. That is, if it takes a step towards the everyday and the common. And I must say, her work is, I wouldn't say trivial, but popular. It is not high aesthetics at all, which also can, and this goes also for Bettauer's work. You can say this already from the equipment of the book. That is quite popular, so to say. It should function in the community and be read. And I will give some examples from this novel, where from these examples you also may see that it is not such a complicated literature, but it can be easily understood. The protagonist of the novel, it was written in 1934, so the political context is clear. The protagonists are designed into clear-cut social positions, such as worker as communist, of course. Then we have an enlightened aristocrat, a deceased bourgeois who is, a decadent bourgeois who is inevitably an adulterer, of course. Furthermore, there we have the sexually inhibited and in political matters thoroughly clueless Christian girl, envious petty bourgeois and social climber who turns out to be a prospective Nazi, etc. Kati Gruber, who is a widow of a communist, and the Countess Agnes, who is obviously an aristocrat, experience a similar political trauma. Contrary to their family backgrounds, their daughters become members of the Austrian National Socialist Party. United through the experience of the brown terror that draws their beloved daughters under its spell, Kati Gruber and Countess Agnes test the possibilities of social mixing which unites workers and aristocrats, wealthy and needy. In Zurmühlen's novels, the political subject comes into being by means of amalgamation and mixing of the previously possibly antagonized positions, as well as by means of transposition of the private, passive and disciplined political identity towards the active, responsible and therefore political or public political action. But I said not only, because her novels don't dispense with the authoritative gesture of moral illustration Rancière is critical about in his prelude to aesthesis. And this also includes the problems of the ethical regime, or also of that reality effect of political agitation and so on. As for the avant-garde art, this was the second part of the aesthetic regime. I will say that although the ideal of social mixing that was, as I said, explicitly borrowed from Kant and Schiller, only seems to meander between the extremely polarized political and philosophical orientations and to also profess an early third way, the conciliatory element of Austromarxist theory wasn't considered to be an end in itself. It was a part of the class struggle that was, however, to be accomplished by thoroughly different means than it was assumed, from Austromarxist perspective, assumed to be the case in Moscow, Budapest or Berlin. Austromarxism used hybridity as a trump card in its own understanding of class struggle. That is, it used hybridity in order to conciliate the revolutionary dream with the plebeian reverie, also quotes from aesthesis. When arguing against the logic of separation of head and hand, Rancière draws a difference between the anarchic principle of aesthetic regime and the authoritarian and archi-political principle of the party, union or political leaders. He seems to assume that every form of leadership, every type of political representation and every mode of political struggle, if it is fought in the sphere of politics as police, has to be parapolitical or archi-political. Acts of founding, moments of institutionalization, bear elements of archi-politics that legitimize the rule of those who had come first over those who arrive afterwards, or those who are naturally predestined to rule over those who are predestined to follow. By way of contrast, the aesthetic avant-garde doesn't refer, I speak now also from, again from Rancière's perspective, the aesthetic avant-garde, by way of contrast to the political, doesn't refer to some fundamental principle or institutional framework. It argues, I quote, a need for separation of art from the forms of aestheticization of common life. This distinction for separation or withdrawal from the crowd allows for a promise of a collective life in the future, and we know that collective life is also very important. These are not only individual gestures or individual art practices, but it is a promise of collective life in the future, and there are, I mean, Rancière says it explicitly. I quote from Aesthesis from the chapter on Walt Whitman. The poet stands among partial men for the complete man. He is the one to reattach words to things and thus inform his contemporaries of a commonwealth. But he informs them precisely of their own commonwealth, not of his own wealth, nor of his personal artistic talent. End of quote. When speaking of Whitman, as well as when speaking of Mallarmé, Rancière seems to bracket out the social conditions of possibility of avant-garde. My question would be how the politics of avant-garde overcome the problems with this withdrawal I addressed earlier when, as I was speaking of Schiller and Hitler's critique on the elitism, actually, or it is not an intended elitism but an implication or impossibility of this collective life when practiced or when implemented only by those who are a minority or few. Does this art, as non-art, remain only a moment of freedom in the sea of the all-pervasive sameness produced by the market, or today a society of spectacle? Can it stand by the promise it gives? That's the question. It is important to mention that Rancière does admit that a certain dose of rule or regime is necessary. This is just a marginal observation from the disagreement. But I would like to read him from the margins as well. In this agreement, Rancière acknowledges that the police can produce all sorts of good, and one kind of police may be infinitely preferable to another. End of quote. But, so he concludes, whether the police is sweet and kind does not make it any less the opposite of politics. This is also something we have to keep in mind. But let me pause at the observation that police can produce all sorts of good, and one kind of police may be infinitely preferable to another. And let me recall again that police is always contaminated with some kind of original institutionalization, that is the act of grounding and installing a regime, be it a political regime within a state, within a city, as in Vienna, or within a pre-existing order of the sensible. Nevertheless, I must say that Austromarxism didn't develop a literary theory or reflected upon literature in a systematic manner, let alone have called for normative poetics. It was quite different from what we later, what later was developed as poetics of social realism. And that is why I rather speak of popular literature than of any kind of normative poetics. Nevertheless, Austromarxism did develop into a planned and analyzed cultural strategy. It established social housing, fostered architecture and public health system. It established a system of workers' libraries, organized public lectures and other performances that constituted a public collective life of aesthetics. And we can really refer to that, or we can really name it collective life of aesthetics, and there are statistics about it. This is not just an interpretation. It was documented, so to say. Thanks to the workers' libraries, it was possible to reach large number of readers. And of course, I said there are some impasses within the Austromarxist political strategy, and we also may discuss that. This is not, of course, not an unknown fact. As for the literary strategy, these libraries contained ideologically divergent authors, from Tolstoy over Karl May, Remarque, and Traven to Gladkov and Gorky. I think, or my claim is that by establishing libraries, Viennese social democracy succeeded in the continuation of emancipatory politics, at least for a while. The institutionalization helped them not to leave only silent traces in the common social space, but to broaden the scope of an egalitarian, cultural and social sensible. To conclude, structural correspondences that I detect between Rancière's hybridization and Austromarxist integral socialism necessarily lead to the question of relating politics and police in a way that could or would ensure the continuation of the emancipatory or egalitarian metapolitical events, scenes, disruptions, we can name it as we wish. That is a continuation of possibilities of translating literally scenes, like isolated scenes, perhaps into a play. I think we, enchanted with Rancière's prose and promises as we are, have to think perhaps with Rancière against Rancière. And by saying this, I really mean with Rancière. The remark on one police being better than the other, I guess and hope may lead the way. Thank you.